The morning of July 11, 1942, began with a silence so heavy it felt like the entire base was holding its breath. The wind off the Pacific carried the scent of oil and salt across the cracked runways of North Island Naval Air Station, San Diego. Mechanics stood frozen beside their tool carts, pilots clustered at the edge of the tarmac, all staring at the strange, scarred aircraft being rolled from a flatbed truck. Its wings looked too thin to belong to a fighter. Its fuselage gleamed in the sunlight like polished bone. It was a Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, and this one had somehow survived capture. The first intact Zero ever to fall into American hands. The men had heard the rumors for months. Pilots burned out of the sky in seconds, dogfights that ended before they began. They called the Zero a ghost plane. Some swore it could climb straight into the sun and vanish. Others said it could turn inside any American fighter alive. And now, here it was, resting before them like a dead predator. Delicate, almost beautiful. Lieutenant Eddie Sanders, a 28-year-old Navy test pilot, walked toward it slowly. He'd spent the war watching his friends vanish in flames over the Coral Sea and Midway, men outflown by an enemy machine that seemed to defy physics. He stopped a few feet away, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the wings, the propeller, the bullet holes patched with tin. "So this is what's been killing us," he muttered under his breath. The ground crew said nothing. The only sound was the ticking of the Zero's cooling engine and the cry of distant gulls. Just months earlier, American pilots had been fighting with the stubby little F4F Wildcats. Slower, heavier, underpowered. They called it the flying coffin. They joked that it couldn't outrun a falling bomb. And while they laughed, the Zero carved its name into the sky, turning dogfights into massacres. In those days, Japan's pilots were legends. Men with thousands of hours of experience from the wars in China. They flew their machines with a kind of predatory grace. Every engagement ended the same way. The Zero on top, the Wildcat smoking into the sea. By 1942, the Pacific had become a graveyard of aluminum. America was losing ground, losing pilots, losing hope. And yet, fate, or maybe irony, delivered this single enemy aircraft to their doorstep. It had come from the Aleutians, where a Zero had crash-landed on Akuten Island after being hit by ground fire. The pilot died instantly when the plane flipped in the marsh. Weeks later, a U.S. salvage crew stumbled upon it. They pulled it out of the mud, repaired it, and shipped it to California. It arrived like a message from the gods, a gift wrapped in tragedy. Now, under the hard sun of San Diego, the Americans would finally stare into the heart of their enemy. Sanders climbed onto the wing, his boots leaving prints in the faded paint. The cockpit was cramped, almost fragile. A paper shell with levers and dials that looked handmade. The smell of fuel and salt lingered inside. The control stick was worn smooth by another man's hand, a man who'd once believed he could never be caught. Sanders ran his fingers across the Japanese labels, squinting at the strange symbols. He felt both awe and anger. This was genius built for war. Every curve, every joint, every rivet screamed efficiency and sacrifice. Behind him, one of the engineers whispered, "It looks like it was built by ghosts." Sanders smiled grimly. "Ghosts don't bleed," he said. They spent days inspecting it. The Zero was light, impossibly light. Its skin was made of aluminum so thin you could press a thumb into it. No armor around the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Every inch had been stripped for speed and range. It was a samurai sword, perfect in balance, deadly in precision, but fragile beneath the surface. Still, the Americans didn't yet understand what they had. That came on the morning of July 20th, when Sanders strapped himself into the cockpit and decided to take it up. The mechanics gathered as the propeller began to turn, sputtering, coughing, then roaring to life. The engine's high-pitched whine echoed across the runway. As the plane rolled forward, it seemed to float, not taxi. And then, in a flash of sunlight, it lifted off the ground and climbed almost vertically into the sky. Sanders felt it immediately. The responsiveness, the eerie smoothness of control. The Zero moved as if it could read his thoughts. Every small movement of the stick produced a graceful roll, a perfect climb. Turned tighter than anything he'd ever flown. He could see now why American pilots had died trying to outturn it. But he also felt something else. A strange hollowness, a vibration deep in the frame. When he pushed the throttle harder, the wings trembled. At high speeds, the controls stiffened. The plane quivered like it was afraid. He grinned inside his oxygen mask. There it is. At altitude, the Zero's strengths revealed its flaw. It was magnificent only within its narrow limits. Beyond them, beyond 250 knots, it became unstable, sluggish. And with no armor, one bullet could light it like kindling. Down below, the mechanics shielded their eyes as Sanders dove the aircraft straight toward the base. A silver blur howling through the clouds. He pulled up just above the runway, the Zero slicing past the control tower so close it rattled the windows. When he landed, his smile said everything. He stepped out, pulled off his gloves, and said, "Gentlemen, the myth just cracked." For the first time in the Pacific War, the U.S. had hope not born of propaganda but of proof. The invincible had become mortal. That night, as the test team gathered around the stripped-down Zero, the mood shifted from awe to hunger. Engineers took notes by lamplight, measuring wings, studying the control systems, sketching the frame. They were no longer afraid of the machine, they were learning from it. Someone poured Sanders a coffee and asked quietly, "What's it like up there?" He stared into the cup for a long time before answering. "It's beautiful," he said, "and it's doomed." Because the truth had become clear. The Zero's perfection came from sacrifice. No protection, no forgiveness, no room for error. It was a masterpiece built by a nation that believed it could not lose. But war does not reward arrogance. The Americans would take that lesson and turn it into steel. Within months, engineers at Grumman began drafting what would become the F6F Hellcat. A machine designed not for grace, but for survival and power. They studied every weakness Sanders found, every hesitation in the Zero's design. Where the Japanese built lightness, Grumman built muscle. Where the Zero was delicate, the Hellcat was brutal. And soon, when these two would meet again in the skies over the Pacific, one would burn and one would rise. Eddie Sanders didn't know it yet, but his flight that July morning marked the beginning of Japan's decline. He had found the fault line in their miracle. He looked back at the silent aircraft, its propeller glinting in the sunset, and whispered, "You were beautiful, but you were never invincible." The hangar at North Island Naval Air Station smelled of oil, dust, and destiny. The captured Zero sat in the center like a dissected god. Its wings removed, its silver body exposed, a halo of tools and blueprints scattered around it. Every day began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. The Navy engineers moved like surgeons, whispering to each other, tracing every wire and rivet as if decoding a divine language. At the far end of the hangar, Lieutenant Eddie Sanders leaned against a workbench, watching as a mechanic peeled back the Zero's skin with a rivet gun. Each pop echoed like the click of a rifle. Beneath that delicate surface, the truth of Japan's engineering was revealed. Precision born of obsession, brilliance tangled with fragility. They measured everything. Wingspan, rudder travel, control response. They discovered that the Zero's control surfaces were balanced with the care of a jeweler. Its flaps operated with uncanny smoothness, its ailerons so light a child could move them. It was art in motion. But beneath the beauty, there was danger. "Too light," one engineer muttered, tapping the frame with a wrench. A burst of .50 cal fire would turn it into confetti. Sanders nodded silently. He'd seen enough dogfights to know the difference between grace and survival. The Zero was a ballerina carrying a sword. The Americans needed a brawler carrying a hammer. Yet that transformation wouldn't come easily. The U.S. war machine was desperate but disorganized. Factories were stretched thin. Pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Every mistake in the sky cost another man's life. Still, what they learned from the captured Zero became gospel. The Japanese had pursued perfection in agility, sacrificing everything for maneuverability and range. Their aircraft could dance but not endure. It was the embodiment of Japan's wartime philosophy. Spirit over steel, precision over protection. But the Americans were pragmatists. They didn't need poetry. They needed victory. Enter Roy Grumman. At his desk in Bethpage, New York, Grumman stared at the first sketches for a new fighter, the F6F Hellcat. His pencil moved like a scalpel, carving muscle and armor where the Zero had air and grace. He'd studied Sanders' reports from San Diego. Every note, every flaw, every number became a weapon. When he first heard of the Zero's design, Grumman was amazed by its genius but horrified by its risk. "It's a samurai blade," he said during one meeting. "Perfectly balanced. But you drop it once, and it shatters." So he vowed to build something that wouldn't break. The Hellcat would be heavier, slower to climb, but unstoppable in a fight. It would dive like a stone and rise like a storm. It would take a punch and throw one back twice as hard. At North Island, Sanders and his team began running mock dogfights using the captured Zero against existing U.S. aircraft, first the Wildcat, then early Hellcat prototypes. It became a dance of death in the California skies. The test pilots launched side by side, engines thundering. Sanders flew the Zero. Another pilot, Lieutenant Bill Leonard, took the prototype Hellcat. From the ground, engineers watched their vapor trail spiral across the blue. "Fight's on!" crackled through the radio. The Zero snapped upward like lightning, turning in a circle so tight it seemed impossible. Sanders grinned inside his oxygen mask, still unbeatable in the turn. But then the Hellcat dove beneath him, roaring past in a blur. Leonard's voice came over the radio. "Can't turn with you, Eddie, but I can dive faster, and I can climb out of it." Sanders tested the Zero's limits, pulling into a steep dive to follow. At 300 knots, the controls stiffened. At 350, the wings began to shake violently. He could feel the frame begging for mercy. He eased off the stick and watched as the heavier Hellcat leveled, banked, and came around. Guns lined perfectly with the Zero's tail. If this had been war, he'd be dead. When they landed, Sanders climbed out and said one thing to the engineers. "She's beautiful, but she's brittle. Build something that bites." Those words became a mantra across Grumman's factory floors. But building a monster that could fight the Zero wasn't just engineering, it was sacrifice. Prototypes crashed. Pilots died testing new engines and armor layouts. One explosion destroyed an entire test cell. Each loss carved a lesson into the Hellcat's design. Grumman called his factory the Iron Works, and it lived up to the name. Sparks flew day and night. Men welded, women riveted. Blueprints turned into wings, wings turned into power. Yet the deeper they understood the Zero, the more they respected it. It was more than a machine, it was a philosophy. The Japanese engineers had stripped away everything unnecessary. The Americans added everything essential. It was as if two cultures were speaking through metal. One whispering poetry, the other shouting resilience. By September 1942, Sanders was invited to Grumman's test field to fly the first operational Hellcat against the data he'd gathered. He remembered touching the Zero's fragile skin in San Diego, and now, running his hand along the Hellcat's armor, he felt the difference. This plane didn't feel delicate, felt inevitable. He climbed into the cockpit. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared like thunder. The ground trembled beneath its 2,000 horsepower. When he throttled up, it didn't dance, it lunged. The takeoff was brutal, the climb steady. This was no graceful bird. It was a predator. At 10,000 feet, he tested its limits, dives, rolls, tight turns. It didn't respond with elegance. It responded with authority. When he landed, Roy Grumman stood by the runway, his hands folded behind his back. "Well?" he asked. Sanders smiled. "She's not a dancer," he said. "She's a brawler, and she's going to change the war." But before the Hellcat could prove itself, the war demanded a price. The Pacific skies remained Japan's domain. Every island, every atoll, every blue mile between carriers was a battlefield. The Zero still dominated the air, taking American bombers apart in swarms. Sanders returned to the test program, flying constant evaluations, pushing limits, risking his life in machines that were sometimes barely airworthy. Once, during a high-speed dive, a wing panel tore loose. He fought the controls all the way down, barely managing to crash land. As medics pulled him from the wreckage, he gasped one sentence: "Don't fix it, understand it." That line became legend inside Grumman. Every weakness was studied, every mistake transformed into armor. America's engineers were no longer copying the enemy, they were evolving beyond him. By the end of 1942, the prototype Hellcat stood ready for mass production. It was the embodiment of everything the Zero had taught them, and everything America refused to forget. Its wings were thicker, its fuel tanks self-sealing, its frame rugged enough to survive brutal carrier landings. The cockpit was built like a fortress. Even the glass could take hits. It wasn't the fastest fighter in the world, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to win and come home. Sanders looked at the first production Hellcat sitting on the tarmac and felt something he hadn't felt in years: balance. The fear of 1941 had been replaced by precision. The humiliation of early defeat transformed into quiet confidence. He thought of the Zero again. Its lightness, its fragility, its pride, and whispered, "You showed us what to build by showing us what to avoid." The captured plane had revealed Japan's fatal flaw: an obsession with perfection that left no room for mistakes. America's strength, in contrast, came from imperfection, trial, failure, resilience. The world didn't yet know it, but the skies were about to shift. The next time the Zero and the Hellcat met, it wouldn't be a test flight. It would be war. The Pacific sky was no longer Japanese blue. By mid-1943, it was streaked with the thunderclouds of change. The roar of Pratt and Whitney engines replacing the soft hum of the Zero's Sakai. The Hellcat had arrived. From the flight decks of carriers like the Essex and the Yorktown, the new American beast crouched in rows. Massive, muscular, painted deep navy blue. Their wings folded like steel fists waiting to strike. Pilots who once feared every encounter with a Zero now climbed into the cockpit with something unfamiliar: confidence. They called it Grumman's Iron Cat. Others simply called it salvation. When the first F6F Hellcats launched from carrier decks in late 1943, the Pacific was still an empire of fire and blood. The Japanese had stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But what they didn't know was that their reign of the skies was already dying. Killed not by numbers, but by understanding. The lessons from that single captured Zero in San Diego had transformed into wings of vengeance. Every flaw the Americans had studied, every weakness Eddie Sanders had felt through the trembling controls, now existed in reverse. The Hellcat was designed to exploit them, deliberately, mercilessly. Its pilots were told, "Don't outturn the Zero. Outfight it. Dive, climb, hit, and live." And they did. The first major test came over the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, Operation Galvanic. Lieutenant Bill "Willie" Leonard, the same test pilot who once dueled Sanders over California skies, now led a squadron of Hellcats over Tarawa. Below them, coral reefs glowed white against turquoise waters. Above them, the sun blazed like a furnace. Radar picked up the swarm, nearly 30 Japanese Zeros approaching from the east. "Here they come," Leonard said calmly into his radio. "Let's see what she can do." The Hellcats turned toward the sun, throttles open, engines howling. The formation of Zeros appeared, silver wings flashing in the light like a school of sharks. For 2 years, those shapes had haunted every American pilot. Now they came again, confident as ever. The dogfight that followed rewrote aviation history. The Zeros tried their usual dance, looping, twisting, rolling tight circles around their prey. But the Hellcats didn't chase. They dove. A Hellcat in a dive was a hammer from heaven. Its thick wings cut through the air with terrifying stability, and its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns spat fire at nearly 1,200 rounds per minute. One Zero exploded before it could finish its first turn, vaporized in a flash of orange. Another tried to climb out and found the Hellcat still there, still climbing. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized they couldn't simply outmaneuver their enemy. They tried to disengage, but the Hellcats had the speed and the strength to pursue. Minutes later, the sky over Tarawa was littered with burning fragments of aluminum. When the fight ended, 30 Japanese planes had fallen for the loss of just 2 Hellcats. The old ratio, once tilted so heavily in Japan's favor, was reversing like a tide pulled by destiny. By early 1944, the U.S. Navy had unleashed a new rhythm across the Pacific. Carrier task forces moved like floating fortresses, launching waves of Hellcats that swept the skies clean before each invasion. Over the Marshall Islands, then the Marianas, then the Philippines, the same pattern repeated. Zeros climbed to meet them. Zeros died. The kill ratio climbed higher. 5 to 1, 9 to 1, 14 to 1, then 19 to 1. For every Hellcat lost, 19 enemy aircraft fell. It wasn't just numbers, it was poetry of reversal. The hunter had become the hunted. The legend of the invincible Zero was collapsing under the weight of its own fragility. Pilots described the feeling as surreal. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, one of the Navy's top aces, recalled his first engagement. They came at us with the same confidence they'd always had, that old arrogance. But when I rolled the Hellcat into a dive, it felt like the sky itself bent in my favor. He downed 6 Zeros in 8 minutes. Another pilot, Ensign Bill Hardy, said, "You could almost see the disbelief on their faces. They turned tight, too tight, and their wings snapped. They weren't fighting machines anymore. They were paper dragons." Japanese ace Saburo Sakai would later write, "The new American fighter could take our bullets and still fly. We could not take theirs and live." The war in the air had shifted not by chance but by philosophy. The Hellcat was not a miracle, it was a response. It was born from humiliation, from study, from the painful admission that the enemy had once been better. And that humility became America's hidden weapon. Grumman's design philosophy turned those lessons into muscle memory. The Hellcat's cockpit was protected with armor plate. Its fuel tank sealed when hit. Its engine could take hits that would have torn a Zero apart. In training, new pilots were told something simple: you're flying a survivor. Treat it that way. And that changed everything. In 1941, American pilots entered combat terrified, often unprepared for Japan's deadly precision. By 1944, they entered combat with a grin, calm, clinical, methodical. They knew how to fight a Zero. They knew its every weakness. They had studied its ghost. Then came the moment of reckoning. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. June 19, 1944, the skies over the Philippine Sea erupted into the largest aerial battle of the Pacific War. Japan threw everything it had, over 400 aircraft from the Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho carriers. Waiting for them, waves of Hellcats from Task Force 58. Radar lit up with blips. The radio crackled with voices. Pilots tightened their harnesses, engines at full power. Remember what Sanders said? One commander reminded them, "Dive, hit, and climb. Don't dance with them." The first wave hit at 10 a.m. The Hellcats tore into them. Gunfire streaked across the sky in silver lines. Explosions rippled through clouds. Japanese pilots screamed into radios, "New type! Strong! Strong!" before disappearing into smoke. Within hours, the outcome was clear. Out of 373 Japanese aircraft launched, 353 were destroyed. American losses, 23. The radio call from a Hellcat squadron leader became legend. "This is like shooting turkeys at a carnival." The phrase stuck, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And with it, Japan's aerial empire died in a single afternoon. That day, aboard the carrier Lexington, a mechanic opened a maintenance log and wrote quietly, almost reverently, "The Hellcat is everything the Zero wanted to be, and everything the Zero could never become." Below decks, pilots celebrated. Some cried. Some simply sat in silence, staring at the ocean they had once feared. Because in that deep blue expanse, a cycle had completed itself, from defeat to dominance, from arrogance to understanding. Eddie Sanders, now stateside, read the combat reports from his desk at North Island. The statistics spoke for themselves. But what moved him most wasn't the numbers. It was the realization that a captured, broken Zero had become the blueprint for victory. He ran a hand over a photograph pinned to the wall. The same plane he'd flown 2 years earlier, its wings folded, its paint peeling in the California sun. He whispered, "We learned from you, and that's how we won." The war was over, but the echoes of engines still haunted the Pacific. By 1945, the skies that had once been filled with fire were now strangely quiet. The Hellcats that had roared across the ocean sat lined up on forgotten runways, wings folded like tired soldiers at rest. The smell of oil, salt, and gunpowder had faded into the scent of rust and rain. In the years after Japan's surrender, those same machines that had ruled the air were either scrapped, stored, or sent to museums. The world had moved on, but inside the hangars, the ghosts remained. The ghosts of pilots, the ghosts of machines, and the ghost of one aircraft that had started it all. At a small museum in California, the captured Zero stood once more beside its conqueror. The two planes side by side, one pale and fragile, one dark and broad-shouldered, seemed locked in silent conversation. Visitors would walk past and read the plaques, maybe take photos, but few understood the depth of irony standing before them. The Zero, once Japan's proudest creation, the symbol of invincibility, now sat under American lights, its skin dulled, its propeller still. Beside it, the F6F Hellcat gleamed like forged iron, its deep blue surface polished to mirror perfection. The story of their rivalry wasn't just about machines. It was about humanity, pride versus humility, obsession versus adaptation, perfection versus resilience. In the beginning, the Zero had been everything Japan wanted to be: elegant, fast, unstoppable. It embodied the nation's wartime philosophy, the spirit of the warrior conquers all. To achieve that, engineers had built it without armor, without self-sealing fuel tanks, and with the lightest possible frame. Could outturn anything in the sky, could climb like a falcon, but it couldn't survive its own myth. By the time the Hellcat arrived, Japan's edge had dulled. Their experienced pilots were gone, their factories bombed, their training schools producing barely skilled recruits. And yet, they still sent those young men into battle with the same fragile machine, the same faith that spirit could overcome steel. History proved otherwise. The Americans had taken the opposite path. Their early failures, the humiliations over the Coral Sea, the terror at Midway, had taught them to learn, to adjust, to evolve. The captured Zero had shown them exactly what not to do. And that humility, that willingness to admit weakness, became their ultimate strength. The irony was as sharp as a blade. The very machine built to represent Japanese superiority had become the blueprint for Japan's defeat. In the late 1940s, Eddie Sanders, older now and quietly retired, visited that museum hangar. He walked slowly across the floor, his cane tapping lightly on the concrete. When he stopped in front of the Zero, he stood for a long time without speaking. The aircraft had been restored. Its faded paint now gleamed again under the lights. Its wings bore the rising sun once more. Sanders placed his hand gently on the fuselage, the same spot he'd touched years ago when it first arrived at North Island. "So," he whispered, "we meet again." He turned his gaze to the Hellcat beside it, the machine that had carried the lessons of this one into victory. He smiled faintly. "Funny thing," he said softly, "you were both right, because in truth, both machines had captured the extremes of human ingenuity. The Zero represented purity of purpose, stripped of compromise, made for perfection. The Hellcat represented survival, heavy, adaptable, and built from imperfection. War had chosen which philosophy would endure. As he stood there, a group of schoolchildren entered the hangar, led by a guide. Their voices bounced off the metal walls. The guide pointed at the Zero first, explaining how it once ruled the skies. The kids' faces lit up with wonder. Then she moved to the Hellcat and told them how it changed the war, how it achieved an almost mythical kill ratio 19-1. Sanders smiled. The numbers were impressive, but he knew the truth went deeper. Those 19 victories weren't just about firepower. They were about knowledge. Every Hellcat carried within it the ghost of that captured Zero. Its blueprints, its weaknesses, its lessons. The machines were not enemies anymore. They were teacher and student, standing together in peace. Outside, the world had entered a new kind of arms race. Jet engines were replacing propellers. Supersonic fighters would soon scream through the skies, and radar-guided missiles would make dogfighting obsolete. But the story of the Zero and the Hellcat still mattered, perhaps more than ever. Because it wasn't a story about technology, it was a story about human nature. The Japanese engineers had built their fighter with faith in perfection. They believed that if a pilot had enough skill and courage, armor was unnecessary. Their flaw wasn't mechanical, it was philosophical. The Americans, on the other hand, built the Hellcat not to be perfect, but to endure imperfection, to survive chaos, mistakes, and punishment. They embraced what the Japanese rejected, the inevitability of failure. And in war, that difference decides who comes home. In a letter written years later, one former Japanese pilot reflected on the same truth. He wrote, "We believed our Zero was a sword. The Americans turned it into a mirror. They learned our strength, reflected it back, and made it stronger." That single sentence captured the entire war in the Pacific, a story of reflection, of learning, of evolution through pain. The Hellcat was not born from genius alone. It was born from humility. Sanders moved closer to the museum plaque and traced the words with his finger. Mitsubishi A6M0, captured on Akutan Island, 1942. Tested at NAS North Island. Findings directly contributed to the design and tactics of the Grumman F6F Hellcat. He exhaled slowly. Somewhere in that short paragraph was the entire arc of a world at war, from arrogance to understanding, from fear to mastery. He could almost hear the voices of the pilots who never returned, men who faced the Zero before anyone knew how to fight it. Their sacrifice had paved the runway for everything that followed. "Your deaths weren't wasted," he murmured. "You helped us learn." In his final years, Sanders often spoke about that lesson at aviation conferences. He would stand before rooms of young pilots, engineers, and historians and say the same line every time. "Machines are reflections of the people who build them. When arrogance builds them, they die. When humility builds them, they endure." It wasn't just a quote about airplanes. It was a truth about civilizations. Japan had built its empire on confidence, and lost it to overconfidence. America had rebuilt its strength through humility, and nearly lost it again when pride took root in later wars. History, Sanders warned, is not a straight line. It's a loop. The same patterns return with new names, new wings, new engines. As the museum lights dimmed, the two planes glowed faintly in the half-darkness. Two opposites locked forever in quiet balance. The Zero's slender frame caught the light like silk. The Hellcat's armor reflected it like stone. They were no longer enemies, but symbols. Symbols of how humanity learns, not from victory, but from defeat. The air around them seemed to hum with memory, as if both machines could still feel the wind of the Pacific, the heat of combat, the weight of history pressing down on their wings. And if one listened closely, one might almost hear the whisper of engines long gone. One graceful, one brutal, both forever bound by the sky they once shared. The original insult, flying coffin, had come full circle. The Zero, once Japan's pride, had become a coffin for its own arrogance. The Hellcat, once doubted, became the vessel of America's redemption. In that hangar, surrounded by silence, Eddie Sanders finally understood the ultimate irony. The greatest victory of the Hellcat wasn't destroying the Zero. It was learning from it. He turned toward the door, his voice echoing faintly in the still air. Arrogance builds legends. Humility builds history. He paused, looked back one last time at the two machines, and smiled. Which one are we building next? The factory floor in Bethpage, New York, roared like a storm of metal and ambition. Sparks flew from welders' torches. The scent of hot aluminum filled the air, and the rhythmic clang of hammers echoed off steel beams like war drums. This was the Grumman Iron Works, and its heart never slept. Day and night, men and women labored under the fluorescent glare, assembling the machine that would carry America across the Pacific, the F6F Hellcat. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a nation's promise made of rivets, sweat, and defiance. Every hour, a new Hellcat rolled off the production line. Wings glinting under the lights, engines rumbling as if impatient for battle. Workers scrawled messages in chalk on the fuselages before they were painted. To Tokyo with love. For my brother at Midway. For Pearl Harbor. It wasn't patriotism in posters anymore. It was patriotism forged in metal. Outside, freight trains waited like veins, ready to carry the newborn Hellcats to the coasts, where ships would deliver them into war. And across the ocean, Japan's empire was crumbling, piece by piece. By 1944, the Hellcat wasn't just another fighter. It was a symbol of inevitability. It flew from carriers that had multiplied like floating cities. Enterprise, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, Essex, Lexington. Each carried squadrons of Hellcats, their blue wings folded tightly on deck, their pilots leaning against the cockpits, smoking cigarettes in the ocean wind. They weren't cocky, not anymore. They were focused. They had inherited a machine that forgave mistakes, that turned survival into a tactic. When the call came, launch all fighters, they moved with quiet precision. The deck crew swarmed like ants, catapults hissed, and the Hellcats roared into the sky one by one, vanishing into the horizon in search of an enemy that had once ruled the same air. Each mission was a rehearsal in dominance. Over the Marshall Islands, the Hellcats swept the sky clean. Over the Marianas, they shredded Japan's carrier air wings. Over the Philippines, they fought through storms and flak, striking airfields and convoys with machine gun fury. Everywhere they went, the same pattern repeated. The Zero appeared, danced for a moment and died in fire. On the deck of the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Alex Vreeshuh checked his instruments. His Hellcat vibrated under full power, ready to leap from the carrier into open air. The order came through his headset. Bandits inbound, 24, Angels 15. Let's clean the sky. He smiled faintly. Roger that. Let's go hunting. As the plane shot down the catapult, the ocean blurred beneath him. The Hellcat climbed effortlessly, the engine's deep growl filling the cockpit. The sun flashed off his canopy. Within minutes, black specks appeared ahead, Zeros, their formations tight, their confidence still intact. They spotted the Americans and broke formation, diving into attack. But this time, the Americans didn't panic. They didn't try to turn and twist with the enemy. They climbed higher, then dove, using gravity as their ally. Vreeshuh rolled in behind a Zero, lined up the gun sight, and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber Brownings unleashed a storm of lead. The Zero disintegrated, a burst of light and fragments tumbling toward the sea. Seconds later, he had another, then another. By the end of the engagement, he'd destroyed 6 Zeros in 8 minutes, one of the most legendary kills of the Pacific War. When he landed, the deck crew cheered. But Vreeshuh didn't smile. He looked down the line of returning Hellcats and said quietly, "This is what we were built for." The Hellcat wasn't glamorous. It didn't have the elegant curves of the Spitfire or the sleek menace of the Mustang. But it didn't need to. It was a bruiser, built to take punishment and deliver it back tenfold. Pilots loved it for one reason. It brought them home. Many told the same story. Bullet holes through the wings, oil leaking from the engine, fuselage torn open. Yet the Hellcat kept flying. Some limped back on one engine. Some landed with half their tail gone. A Marine pilot once said, "You could fly her through hell and still make breakfast." The Zero had been built for perfection. The Hellcat was built for forgiveness. And in war, forgiveness wins. Back at Grumman's Iron Works, Roy Grumman walked the production floor with his hands behind his back, watching another Hellcat roll toward its crate. The engineers cheered, exhausted but proud. He didn't smile often, but that day he did. "You built her right," he said quietly. "You built her to save lives." He knew what few people understood. The Hellcat had not just won battles, it had preserved pilots. In a war of attrition, that mattered more than speed or style. Statistics would later confirm what pilots already felt in their bones. The F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,163 enemy aircraft. It achieved an overall kill ratio of 19-1. It accounted for 75% of all aerial victories by the U.S. Navy. Those weren't just numbers. They were testaments to the industrial and emotional willpower of a nation that had refused to surrender. But the machine that saved the Pacific did more than win a war. It redefined how wars were fought. The Hellcat's success wasn't born from a single genius idea. It was born from cooperation. Thousands of minds, hands, and hearts worked together. Test pilots, engineers, riveters, mothers, widows, and veterans, all united by purpose. The same America that had once been caught sleeping at Pearl Harbor now moved with mechanical precision. Each bolt turned, each plane launched was an act of redemption. It wasn't just the Hellcat that lifted America. It was what it represented. Learning, resilience, unity. The plane had become a mirror of a nation, scarred but unbroken. On carrier decks at dusk, after missions were complete, the Pacific would fall silent again. Pilots sat on the wings of their Hellcats, helmets off, eyes fixed on the burning horizon. The sea below glimmered with the fading light of battle. They didn't talk much. Words couldn't capture what they'd seen. But sometimes one of them would look down at the Hellcat's bullet-scarred paint, pat it gently, and whisper, "Thanks, girl." Somehow it felt alive, like a loyal animal that had carried them through fire. They knew the truth. The Hellcat had saved them as much as they had flown it. As 1945 drew to a close and the mushroom clouds rose over Japan, the Hellcat's mission was done. The war that had forged it was ending. Yet, even as jets replaced propellers and technology leaped ahead, the Hellcat's legacy endured. It wasn't just a warplane. It was a philosophy in metal form. Build to endure, learn from your enemy, and never underestimate humility. In that sense, it had saved more than the Pacific. It had saved a generation of engineers and pilots from repeating the same blind pride that had doomed their adversary. Years later, at the Bethpage factory's closing ceremony, an old worker, one of the women who had riveted the wings, was asked what she remembered most. She smiled through tears. "Every time we tightened a bolt," she said, "we thought of the boys who'd sit behind it. We built it so they'd come home." That was the soul of the Hellcat, not steel but sacrifice. At sunset, a preserved Hellcat still sits on the deck of the USS Yorktown Museum, facing east over the Atlantic, its nose pointed toward the horizon where the Pacific once burned. The wind whistles through its canopy, and if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo of those old engines. Steady, thunderous, relentless. That sound isn't war. It's will. The will to learn. The will to adapt. The will to survive. The museum was quiet that afternoon. Outside, the California sun poured through high glass windows, painting the floor with warm rectangles of light. Dust floated through the air like slow-moving memories. At the center of the hall stood two aircraft that had once defined an era, the Mitsubishi A6M0 and the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Their propellers no longer spun, their wings no longer cut the sky, yet somehow they still radiated power. The silence between them was not emptiness. It was conversation. Visitors passed by, snapping photos, murmuring facts. But for those who listened closely, there was a hum beneath the quiet, the faint whisper of engines, the echo of a time when the air itself burned with war. Among the visitors that day was an old man in a navy blazer. His hair was white now, his posture bent, but his eyes still carried that sharp glint of sky-colored steel. His name was Captain Eddie Sanders, the man who, more than 3 decades earlier, had first test-flown the captured Zero that revealed Japan's fatal flaw. He moved slowly toward the two planes, each step echoing across the polished floor. Children looked at him curiously, unaware that this quiet visitor had once danced with death at 10,000 feet. When he reached the Zero, he stopped. His hand hovered just above its wing, hesitant, almost reverent. The metal was cold, smooth, fragile under his fingers. He remembered the first time he'd touched that same surface back in 1942. The same strange mix of awe and disbelief. Back then, this aircraft had been the face of terror. Now it was just history. Funny, he murmured to himself. How something that once ruled the sky now needs ropes to keep it standing. He turned and looked at the Hellcat beside it, the machine that had taken everything this one had taught and turned it into victory. Its thick armor gleamed under the lights, still intimidating even in stillness. Between them, decades of war, sacrifice, and learning hung like invisible air currents. Sanders took a seat on the nearby bench, his eyes never leaving the two planes. A young docent, barely 20, approached and recognized him. "Captain Sanders," she said softly. "You flew the Akutan Zero, didn't you?" He smiled faintly. "A long time ago." The girl hesitated, then asked, "What was it like?" He leaned back, eyes distant. "Like shaking hands with the devil," he said. "Beautiful, deadly, and fragile. You could feel the genius in its design, but you could also feel the arrogance. It thought it could never fall." The girl nodded slowly, scribbling notes on her clipboard. "And the Hellcat? What made it different?" Sanders' voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "The Hellcat knew it could fall, and that's why it didn't." She frowned slightly, not understanding, but he didn't explain further. Some truths were meant to be felt, not analyzed. The Zero had been born from Japan's vision of perfection, built for pilots who believed that courage and skill could conquer physics. It embodied the samurai spirit, pure, fearless, uncompromising. But that same purity became its weakness. By refusing armor, Japan had built a masterpiece that could never forgive mistakes. By chasing agility, it had sacrificed endurance. In contrast, the Hellcat was the opposite. Rugged, adaptable, humble. It didn't need to be flawless, it just needed to survive. And that difference, Sanders thought, was the reason one ended up behind velvet ropes while the other helped win a world war. He remembered the faces of men who had flown both kinds of machines. Some never returned. Some did, forever changed. Japanese pilots had once believed they were invincible, warriors chosen by heaven. When their Zeros began falling like autumn leaves, many refused to believe it. Some turned themselves into human bombs rather than face defeat. They thought dying proved their honor. But Sanders, who had seen too many bodies pulled from the sea, knew that honor meant something else. It meant learning, adapting, staying alive so others could learn from you. "War doesn't reward pride," he said under his breath. "It rewards those who listen." The museum's intercom announced closing time. Most visitors drifted toward the exit, but Sanders remained seated. He wanted to be alone with the machines a little longer. He looked at the Zero again. So sleek, so deceptively light. In its reflection, he saw a warning that extended far beyond aviation. Every empire that believes itself invincible builds its own Zero. They strip away humility for speed, strip away caution for beauty, and eventually discover, too late, that the sky doesn't forgive arrogance. He thought of the wars that followed, Korea, Vietnam, even the new machines streaking across the Middle East and beyond. The technology had evolved, but the psychology hadn't. Nations still built their perfect weapons, still trusted in the illusion of superiority. Sanders sighed. "We keep building Zeros," he whispered, "just faster ones." In the decades since the war, engineers and historians had studied the Hellcat and the Zero not as weapons, but as philosophies. The Zero taught the cost of perfection, the danger of brilliance without balance. The Hellcat taught the power of humility, of designing not for glory, but for endurance. Together, they became the yin and yang of aerial warfare, one born from pride, the other from adaptation. Sanders often thought that if nations could understand that contrast, they might stop repeating the same mistakes. But he doubted they would. A young boy, maybe 12, approached the bench. He had a notebook and an aviation patch on his jacket. "Mister," he asked, "which one do you like better?" Sanders smiled, looking between the two planes. "Both," he said after a long pause. "One taught us how to fly, the other taught us how to live." The boy squinted. "But the Hellcat one, right?" Sanders chuckled softly. "Yes, but winning isn't always the same as understanding. The Zero lost the war, but it gave us the wisdom to end it." The boy nodded thoughtfully, then ran back to his parents. Sanders looked back at the two planes again. The light had shifted, the sun now low, turning the aluminum and steel into gold. For a moment, the two machines seemed alive again, glowing side by side like old rivals turned brothers. He thought of a quote he'd once read from a Japanese engineer who had worked on the Zero's design. It was found decades after the war in a private letter. "We built the perfect fighter for 1940, and forgot that time moves forward. Perfection lasts only until the world changes." That was the lesson of the Zero. And the Hellcat's lesson was its answer: build not for perfection, build for change. That idea would guide generations of aircraft to come, from the Phantom to the F-14, from the stealth bomber to the space shuttle. The Hellcat's DNA wasn't just in steel and rivets. It was in mindset. As the museum lights dimmed, Sanders rose slowly to his feet. His reflection shimmered on the Hellcat's dark wing. He placed one hand on it, then turned back to the Zero and did the same. "Thank you," he said softly to both of them, because in the end, neither had truly lost. The Zero's beauty had taught humility. The Hellcat's power had taught restraint. Together, they had shaped not just the war, but the men who survived it, men who learned that innovation means nothing without wisdom. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of jet fuel from a nearby airfield, a reminder that the sky still belonged to those who dared to rise. Sanders watched a modern fighter streak overhead, a blur of metal and thunder, leaving a white contrail that cut the clouds in two. He smiled faintly. "Your great-grandfathers are in there somewhere," he said to the sky. Then, with slow steps, he walked toward the exit, his shadow stretching long across the hangar floor. Behind him, the Zero and the Hellcat stood together beneath the fading light, silent witnesses to humanity's endless duel between pride and progress. And though their engines would never roar again, their story still spoke. A whisper carried on every gust of wind, every new design, every lesson learned too late. Because history is not made by those who never fall. It is made by those who rise after they do.